At the beginning of each summer, when I plan the topics for the next year for the coming sermons, I try to be increasingly aware of topics that I may have been neglecting. Now, some I'm conscious of, and I'm sort of neglecting for better or worse because I only preach about 40 Sundays a year, and there's a lot to say about the things going on in life, the universe, and everything. But others, such as at the end of my second year as your minister, I realized I had never preached about Islam. And if we're serious about the goal of drawing wisdom from all the world's religions, balanced with the insights of modern science, it's probably a mistake to not mention the world's second largest religion. And since 2014, I have preached about Islam at least once annually. And I look forward to sharing future topics with you about progressive Islam, 21st century interpretations of the Quran, the life and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, and Rumi, the best-selling poet who is also a Muslim mystic. As Nancy shared earlier, there are approximately 1.5 billion Muslims in the world today, making it the world's second largest religion. Christianity is the first largest with 2.1 billion adherents. The Hindu tradition is third, coming in at 900 million. I should add that projections estimate that Islam will become the world's largest religion, likely somewhere around 2070. So there are many reasons to increase our familiarity with the Islamic tradition, from correcting misinformation that unnecessarily exacerbates Islamophobia to being equipped to advocate for a more open, tolerant, and progressive Islam of the future. And our motivation should be not only to dismantle prejudice, which by all means is a worthy goal in and of itself, but also to end the irrational wasting of our resources. To give just one example, by the end of 2016, Muslim terrorists were responsible for 123 of the 240,000 murders that have happened in this country since 9/11. 123 of the almost 250,000. That's far less than 1% for those quickly doing math in your head. Yet counterterrorism remains the number one priority of the FBI, which spends several $1 billion annually to prevent and prosecute Muslim terrorists. Moreover, when our government crosses over into routine harassment of innocent Muslim citizens, we increase the likelihood of sowing the very seeds of resentment and alienation that can create the soil in which future terrorism can most easily grow. Here at the beginning, it may also be helpful to illuminate just a few more data points that stand out from an important new survey released just a few weeks ago about America's changing religious identity. The banner headline is that white Christians, not just white people, but white Christians, once the dominant religious group in the United States, now account for fewer than half of all adults living in this country. Today, fewer than half of all states are majority white Christian. As recently as 2007, 39 states had majority white Christian populations. There's also some fascinating data points about Unitarian Universalism that I'll share another time, but since our focus is on Islam, there are two more trends about Muslims in America that may be worth highlighting. The first is that non-Christian religious groups are growing, but they still represent less than 1 in 10 Americans combined. Jewish Americans are about 2% of the American public, while Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus each constitute only 1% of the public. All other non-Christian religions constitute an additional 1%. Second, America's youngest religious groups are all non-Christian. Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists are all far younger than white Christian groups. At least 1/3 of Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists are under the age of 30. Roughly 1/3 of religious unaffiliated Americans are also under the age of 30. In contrast, white Christian groups are aging. Slightly more than 1 in 10 white Catholics, white evangelical Protestants, white mainline Protestants are under 30, just 1 in 10. Approximately 6 in 10 evangelical Christians, white Catholics, white mainline Protestants are at least 50 years old. And I'm trying to, no ageist emails, I'm just reporting the data, right? I'm not trying to say there's anything wrong with that. I'm getting up there too. So, I'll turn 40 this year. The median ages of, right? We'll talk about relative ages.
It's another sermon.
Yes. I talk about it every year when I do the graduation. You know, the graduates, they're always 18, and we all just keep getting older. The median age of Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists, religiously unaffiliated Americans, and Hispanic Protestants are below 40. Now, that's a lot of numbers to keep track of, I realize, so let me give you just the two highlights. Muslims are approximately 1% of the U.S. population, and of that 1%, 1/3 are under the age of 30. And although I don't want to overwhelm you with data, there are just a few more helpful points worth considering about how Islam in America has changed in recent decades. In 1967, there were probably fewer than 250,000 self-identifying Muslims in the United States. Today, there are about 3.3 million. So we've gone from 250,000 to more than 3 million since 1967. The growth of the Muslim community is largely due to immigration, in particular the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act signed by President Lyndon Johnson. He signed it in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, trying to actively make a difference in legislation that would reform our clearly racist immigration system that prohibited immigrants from countries perceived as non-white. And millions of non-white people have immigrated to the United States since then. Perhaps 2 million of those have been Muslim. The second thing is that in 1967, there were perhaps 200 mosques in the United States. Today, there are more than 2,000. So from 1967 to today, we've gone from around 200 mosques to around 2,000. Today, the sectarian profile of Muslim Americans roughly mirrors the rest of the Muslim world. So the majority of Muslim Americans are Sunni, while 16% identify as Shia. 14% say, I'm just a Muslim. And 4% are members of smaller communities, such as the Nation of Islam, for example. All right, no more data, I promise, at least this morning. But my larger point is that the stories we tell matter. And some of this data begins to point us toward how we might tell a different story, a better story than the tired debates about Islam versus the West and Islam versus America, which have often or almost always been lacking in historical context. As Amir Hussein, a theology professor at Loyola Marymount University, details in her important book, Muslims in America, it is more accurate historically and arguably much more helpful and hopeful to tell a story about Islam in the West and Islam in America. After all, there have been Muslims in the United States of America or in this land since long before it was the United States of America. As an example of learning to tell that story, I'll lift up just one paragraph from a 2009 speech that President Obama delivered to the Muslim world at Cairo University. He said, Islam has always been a part of America's story. He said, the first nation to recognize my country was Morocco. In signing the Treaty of Tripoli in 1796, our second president, John Adams, wrote that the United States has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims. And since our founding, American Muslims have enriched the United States. They have fought in our wars, served in our government, stood for civil rights, started businesses, taught in our universities, excelled in our sports arenas, won Nobel Prizes, built our tallest buildings, and lit the Olympic torch. And when the first Muslim American was recently elected to Congress, he took the oath to defend our Constitution using the same Holy Quran that one of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, kept in his personal library. Jefferson was also learning Arabic in addition to the many other languages that he knew. I'll unpack just a few of those details more fully. Regarding that first line, that Islam has always been a part of America's story, here's just one example. We have a biography from 1734, quite a bit before 1776, about Job bin Solomon, an enslaved African Muslim who in 1730 was sold in Annapolis, Maryland, less than 90 minutes from here by car. Part of why we know about him at all, including that he was a Muslim, is that his owner found it remarkable that Job could both speak and write Arabic. Similarly, some of you may recall from Alex Haley's 1977 television miniseries Roots, about tracing his ancestry, there's a scene in which Kunta Kinte, played by LeVar Burton, shares with his mentor, played by Louis Gossett Jr., about being a Muslim. I should perhaps also note that Kunta Kinte, who was also sold in Annapolis, by the way, note that Kunta Kinte was also sold in Annapolis. To widen our lens beyond these two specific examples, historians estimate that somewhere between 10 and 20% of the enslaved people brought to this country from West Africa were all Muslim. The first Muslim immigrants to North America other than enslaved people were from the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century and first half of the 20th. Enslaved Muslims helped enrich and build this country from before the beginning. Indeed, George Washington, the first president of the United States, owned two enslaved Muslims named Fatima and Little Fatima, the namesake of the youngest daughter of the Prophet Muhammad and his first wife and first follower, Khadijah. So enslaved Muslims also helped build Mount Vernon, specifically. Turning the clock back further, we have records about Estebancio the Moor, an enslaved Muslim owned by a Spanish conquistador who landed in Florida in 1528. Estebancio was part of a group that explored Florida and Arizona before being killed by a member of the Zuni tribe in 1539 in what is now New Mexico. So almost 80 years before the Pilgrims landed in America, a Muslim had already explored uncharted territory and died here. Turning the clock back just one more time, it's perhaps important to remember that in the same year, 1492, that we're told Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Spain was expelling all of the Jews and Muslims from its country that same year of 1492, all that refused to convert to Christianity. And relatedly, there's a fascinating book in the part of the 1994 book, Shards of Love, by the late Maria Rosa Menocal, who's the Sterling Professor of Humanities at Yale University. She wrote about Luis de Torres, Converso, a Jewish person forced to convert to Christianity, who was part of Columbus's expedition as a translator. De Torres could speak Arabic and Hebrew in addition to Portuguese. Now this is where the historical records get a little fuzzy. But it seems that when Columbus landed in Cuba, de Torres was able to speak in Arabic to some of the Taino chiefs in Cuba. This lends some potential credence to the legends from the 10th and 12th centuries of Arabic sailors crossing the Atlantic, perhaps pre-Columbian contacts. Regardless, Menocal writes about what does it mean to know about the speaking of Arabic in the New World, as in the Old it was being outlawed. Now I don't know, I don't want to get us distracted on this speculative point, but irrespective of that, we know much more definitively that 10,000 years, of course, before Columbus's voyage, in approximately 8500 BCE, semi-nomadic herders of hunter-gatherers began practicing agriculture in this land, on this continent, becoming the indigenous residents. So as Columbus Day approaches next month, it's important to remind ourselves periodically of what so many history books fail to emphasize, that even though our nation's capital, the District of Columbia, is named after him, it turns out Columbus didn't discover America. He never set foot in North America, much less on the land we know today as the United States. Columbus's first voyage landed in what is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. When he returned on his second voyage, what he discovered was that his colony of 40 men had all been killed by indigenous people. On his third trip, he landed in what is now Venezuela, and on his fourth and final trip, he reached the Caribbean coast of Central America. But we are now definitely as far back in history as I want us to go this morning. So let me give you one more historical example of Muslims in America before moving into much more contemporary times. Given all the violence that has erupted about the images around the Prophet Muhammad and the censorship around that, most commentators, I find it interesting, fail to note, some of you probably know this, that there is an image of the Prophet Muhammad with holding a sword and a Quran that's in a frieze on the walls of the United States Supreme Court. The intention of this art, which depicts many other figures, is to honor the great lawgivers of history. But given all the controversy, maybe it's best to say, shh, don't tell anybody. Let's just keep that between you and me. Yeah. How many of you have seen that phrase in the Supreme Court? All right, so at least one of you. In contrast, perhaps the one place that Muslims have been very much not hiding in American public life is in the sports arena. So Cassius Clay, one of the most famous athletes of all time, changed his name to the very Islamic choice of Muhammad Ali. There's a lot to be said about that story, including him being arrested, having his boxing title stripped, being unable to box starting in 1967, for being a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War based on his understandings of Islamic teachings about not participating in unjust wars. He famously said, "I have no quarrel with the Viet Cong. As far as I know, no Viet Cong ever called me the N-word." In 1971, the United States Supreme Court unanimously overturned the conviction of Muhammad Ali. And in addition to Muhammad Ali, there's so many examples of prominent Muslim American athletes. To name only a few examples, starting with basketball, there's Ferdinand Lewis Alcindor Jr., who became in 1971 Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. There's also Hakeem Olajuwon. Moving to football, Ahmad Rashad, the wide receiver for the Vikings, Muhammad Wilkerson, a defensive end for the Jets, the Abdullah brothers, Hussein and Hamza, who are both safeties in the NFL, Aqib Talib, a cornerback for the Denver Broncos. Shahid Khan is a Muslim who is the owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Ibtaja Muhammad, a member of the U.S. fencing team, who at the 2016 Olympics became the first American woman to compete wearing a hijab. Now, there's some interesting dynamics that you can look through in almost all these cases that have arisen when these popular athletes have periodically acted in public, not only as celebrities, but in ways that clearly identify them as acting on their Muslim values. And there's a lot more to say about Islam in America, but my hope is that at least in some small part, that this sermon can contribute to giving light to the perception that Islam is wholly new to America, wholly foreign to America, or composed of adherents who are all violent and un-American or a threat to our nation. Instead, many of us here at UCF were reminded firsthand recently through our participation in the Solidarity with Our Muslim Neighbors rally earlier this year at the Islamic Society of Frederick, or our recent experience having a potluck here with the Islamic Society of Frederick right here in this sanctuary. We were reminded of the reality that has always been the case, that most Muslims in America, they're our neighbors, they're our fellow citizens, they're our doctors, our teachers, our friends. So these debates about Islam in the West and Islam in the America, as if they were two completely separate things, have been far too frequently exaggerated and exploited for political gain. May we be part of learning to tell a better story, a more accurate story, a more hopeful story about American Muslims, about Islam in America, about Muslims who have always been here since before there was an America. In that spirit of liberality, of generosity, of drawing a wider circle, please rise with me and body your spirit. Let's sing together hymn 287, Faith of the Larger